Okay, I think that's everybody. I just want to say bienvenue and welcome to the CanCOVID Speaker Series. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Greta Bauer. As a reminder for some Zoom etiquette, please keep your microphone off for the duration unless you would like to ask a question. If you would like to ask a question once Dr. Bauer has finished, please hold up your hand, or if you prefer, ask your question in the chat box and I will read it aloud. You can go ahead and ask questions during, and I just won't be saying them aloud until the end. N'hésitez pas à poser des questions en français si vous préférez. And now, without further ado, I will turn the screen sharing floor over to Dr. Bauer.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining me on this Friday afternoon for a brief discussion on integrating social identity and position variables into COVID research. We're just going to be able to touch on a few key things in a brief amount of time, and I'm sure you'll have questions and we can follow up with other discussions. I'm going to try to provide some resources as I go as well. So we have these slides available for sharing if anybody would like them afterward. So I think it's apparent from what we've seen in the media and what the discussions have been happening that variables around social identity and position are incredibly important to understanding not just the trajectory of the COVID-19 pandemic and who gets infected and mortality from this new disease, but also to understanding equity related to that and understanding the impacts of the social responses we've had to it. Both the organized social responses in terms of lockdown and the other social responses we've had, like an increase in anti-Asian racist events, for example, that have related to COVID. So this is all incredibly important. And the first point that I want to make is that we need data. So we've been seeing a lot of data come out around age. We've been seeing some things out around gender. We occasionally get to see those cross-classified, so we get to see age by gender. We don't have a lot of race and ethnicity data in Canada. We have data on Indigenous people in terms of cases, but not deaths. Death data is very limited. And there's been a big push from a lot of different people, a lot of different organizations, including from within CanCOVID, for the collection of race-based data. So Manitoba is doing that now. Toronto Public Health is doing that now. Quebec said they were going to do it until 2 days ago, where they said they're not going to do it. And so the first step in terms of this is to actually include these measures in data collection so we can start to see what's going on. You know, for example, if the racial disparities that we're seeing in the US related to incidents and to death are something that we're also seeing in Canada. So first thing is data collection. There are some ethical considerations around collection of data that have been voiced by people who don't want to collect some of these variables, but are legitimate concerns, not to waylay collection, but to keep in mind. And the first is that part of the reason for collecting them is ethics, actually, to identify and protect groups within society, but to do that also in a way that avoids attaching disease-related stigma to groups. So we've seen that already, again, with anti-Chinese kind of actions and incidents in terms of COVID. It's something that we saw really harshly with relation to HIV when that emerged, and we need to learn from that and to be really cautious about how we're putting out that information. And some of the ways that we can do that is by considering multidimensionality and making distinctions between different dimensions of these things that we're looking at. I'm going to talk more about that. But also collecting data on context and potential explanations. So we're not just putting out, you know, this group is more likely to X, this group is less likely to Y, that we're actually then saying, why? You know, why would that happen? And asking those questions early so that we can collect the kinds of data we need to be able to explain those findings later. And importantly, so that we can provide communities with the information that they want and that they need to understand their own health issues and to develop their own strategies. So I'm going to talk a bit about multidimensionality and measurement. I'm going to talk about sex and gender and some work that I've done, but that's not where I'm going to start. I'm going to start with some work on indigeneity and on race scholarship. So this is the first of the resources I'm just kind of putting here as I go along that you may want to dive into a little deeper, and that is the Indigenous Statistics book by Maggie Walter and Chris Anderson. Based on some of Dr. Anderson's earlier work, it talks about categorization in terms of being based on administrative desires rather than lived reality. and the differences between identity, community membership, and what community claims you, ethnic heritage or background, and legal status. These kind of things can all have really different impacts on health, and they can be measured differently, they can be gathered differently. And similarly, critical race scholars have long critiqued classifications of race in the sense that it's not a monolithic thing. And we can measure these. We can differentiate between somebody's racial identity, their meta-perceived race, or how other people perceive them, regardless of how they identify, and their experiences of racism, race-associated cultural factors with that, like diet, for example, structural racism effects, and economic marginalization. So we can measure all of this. And similarity with other social identities or positions. We can differentiate between having a disability identity and a diagnosis, for example. We can differentiate between different socioeconomic dimensions. So we're a little bit more familiar with this in Canada sometimes when it comes to, when it comes to sex and gender, because of how that's been enshrined in policy, right? So everybody who just did a COVID-19 grant or any grant, you've had to differentiate between sex and gender in how your research approaches these issues. And that's because of our policies. So we've had the message loud and clear that sex is biological, gender is social, and that they're not the same thing. But we don't as often think about different dimensions of sex and different dimensions of gender. And what I've put up here is just a tool. It's not exhaustive. I created it some years ago to help researchers start to think through what's actually important in the questions that they're asking. Are you interested in chromosomal sex? Sex assigned at birth? Those aren't going to change over the life course, but hormonal milieu might. Both endogenous and exogenous hormones, genital and reproductive organs might. There's gender identity, there's the gender somebody lives in or expresses, there's masculinity and femininity, which are culturally and historically specific. And then we can look across sex and gender and identify a broad group of trans people, as well as looking at trans and non-binary identities, for example. But even within this, so looking at it this way can help us avoid assumptions that if we know one thing, we know them all. So if we know, for example, in our database that somebody's male, we might assume that then we know, and I've just picked a few things that have been hypothesized as related to COVID-19, that they have XY chromosomes. And so X-linked factors are going to follow those patterns, that they have testicles, that they don't have a potentially protective level of estrogen, that life course factors are going to involve having always lived as a boy or as a man, and that they may exhibit gendered behaviors like being more likely to smoke tobacco. So again, we can measure those things. So I'm just calling here for a complexity of thinking around multidimensionality, even when we talk about domains that may seem similar or that may seem safe. So I just give you a quick example. On the left here is a 1998 study, Canadian study looking at unmet need for pap smears that had originally found an increase in unmet need by age. And then they went back and they adjusted their analysis for hysterectomy status. So instead of assuming that woman equals has uterus, they actually looked at what they were adjusted for what they wanted to capture in terms of dimension. And they found that, in fact, they didn't see that age-related pattern any longer. Now, it took up until the last 6 years or so to have a substantial body of literature develop that's actually gone through cervical uterine cancer research and done hysterectomy correction for all of it. And interestingly, the findings aren't just changes to understanding of incidence of these sexual and reproductive cancers, but also things like racial disparities are of a different magnitude than previously estimated. So they're larger than previously estimated. So these kind of inadvertent use of proxy measures for different dimensions of these variables can be a problem, even where it's something that may seem intuitive to people like women having uteri. So if we were to treat this like we do measurement for other variables, we would actually probably estimate the test performance of that as a proxy measure, and we can do that. We can do that where we're saying, what if we acknowledge that we're treating administrative sex gender in our database as a measure of uterine status, and even just using Statistics Canada and other sources of data, we can look at this in terms of test performance and see that while there's relatively good sensitivity, that's the proportion with uteri who are women, that specificity, the proportion without uteri who are men, is actually lower. And furthermore, it goes down with age as hysterectomy prevalence increases, making for a positive predictive value that also changes with age. So what's important about this is that if we acknowledge it, if we analyze it, we can actually be specific about what we're measuring. And we can look at the performance of that measurement. And in this case, it's not just about misclassification in our research. It actually has the power to drive findings in the way that this type of measurement misclassification drove findings like the false finding of an increase in unmet need for pap smears with age. So I just wanted to call for us to think a little bit more complexly about these different dimensions, not just with sex and gender, but across social identity and position. You're probably aware that a couple of years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, Statistics Canada announced new sex and gender standards that collect data on birth assigned sex and gender, which is conceptualized a little bit more as lived gender in the way that it's measured, in the way that it's asked, in the way that people answer it. So this is a two-step question. These questions usually collect sex assigned at birth and either gender identity or lived gender. Then you can cross-classify and identify gender diverse people from that. There are different ways to use these kind of measures, including ones where we give more options for gender, including Indigenous or other cultural gender identities, and where we might differentiate that from the gender people live as in their day-to-day lives. And these kind of questions we may also adapt for specific populations. So when we use this in Transpulse Canada, our large national survey of transgender and non-binary people, we used the option of an open-ended question first. We included a bit more explanation as to why we were asking these questions, because we have a group that is more critical of these kinds of questions, has a deeper understanding of sex and gender on average. And we changed the wording a bit to make sure that we used man or boy, woman or girl for gender, because people being a bit more sophisticated in their understanding of that. So we can measure multiple dimensions. We can be more specific about what it is that we're measuring. And if we're using secondary data and we don't have the option to change our measures, I think that it's important that we really think about what's playing a role in what we're doing. And if we've got a measure of race and what we're really interested in is experiences of racism, for example, we can at least acknowledge that. We can look at the research that's looked at the relationship between those, and we can incorporate that in our interpretation and our understanding of our own work. So that's the first thing I wanted to leave you with. The second, actually, the first is we need to collect the data to analyze it. The second is the importance of thinking about multidimensionality across these with regard to identities and positions and processes. And the third I want to talk about is the importance of taking an intersectional analysis to this. At its simplest level, what we've seen is in COVID research, a lot of breakdowns by age, for example, or by gender. Sometimes we do get that age by gender, but I haven't seen any really in-depth intersectional analyses that look at the experiences of people in terms of their health, their well-being, their behavior, whatever it may be going forward, the impacts of lockdown at different intersections. So intersectionality is a Black feminist theory that comes out of the US. The term was coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in terms of her concerns around human rights approaches, where people were forced to file under sex or under race, but not under both. And also from the work of sociologist Dr. Patricia Hill Collins, but it draws on much earlier central Black feminist concepts. And it has a focus on the specificity of experiences at social intersections, how they're mutually constituted, and how you can't pull those apart and make somebody, ascribe their experiences to different parts of their identity or different parts of themselves. So from a research perspective, as that's moved into research, it's an analytic framework, not a hypothesis. You're not analyzing and testing intersectionality. It's about how we frame our work with an emphasis on structural inequality and power dynamics, social identities, perceptions, positions, and processes. So I want to give you a couple of resources here again. And again, the slides for people who just came in, the slides are available for sharing. So I'm just dropping in resources you may want to use. The one on the left is from 10 years ago by Chandra Ford and Colin Zariahan-Bua. And it's a public health critical race methodology, which of course is an intersectional methodology. In Canada, we sometimes think about intersectionality as an extension of sex and gender research because we've had gender-based analysis as a policy since 1995. And a plus was added to that by Status of Women in 2011 to connote an intersectional approach to gender-based analysis. And so people sometimes think that intersectionality is an expansion on that. It could just as easily be an expansion on critical race theories and methodologies. So these two papers are about public health, population health research specifically, and social science and medicine's been putting out a lot of good methods publications in social epidemiology, if you're interested in that. So, and the one on the right is one that I wrote 6 years ago on challenges and potentials in incorporating intersectionality into population health research methodology. So it's a nice walkthrough and some of the things to think about in terms of the work that you're doing. How do we allow embodiment for people, not requiring them to disaggregate their experiences? You know, how do we deal with statistical issues? How do we conceptualize without assuming that we have a unilevel rather than a multi-level issue? So with these backgrounds in critical race theory and in feminism, it's not that surprising that when we look at the social categories that people are using in quantitative intersectional work, the top two are sex, gender, and race ethnicity. But this is extendable to all of these other categories. And in fact, I would like to see more work that's intersectional across disability studies, for example, in geography with regard to immigration. This is just from an in-process systematic review. So we've got another year and a half of data to add to that. So I just want to give you a really quick example of one of the, just to show you why it's so important, even with a fairly simple analysis. This is from a well-cited New England Journal of Medicine paper. It was an experimental study looking at physician referrals for cardiac catheterization, how they treated actor patients differently depending on their age, which didn't play a role, but also their gender and their race. And the authors and press reports concluded that women and Blacks were less likely to be referred for cardiac catheterization than men and whites, respectively. What the authors presented is captured in the figure that I created here on the left. But what was actually happening is what's on the right. There was only one group of the four that experienced reduced referrals for cardiac catheterizations, and that was Black women. So what happened? The authors were taking an additive approach. They assumed you could take the average effects of being Black, the average effects of being a woman, and if you added those together, you would have the experience of Black women. So that led them to falsely conclude that there was also reduced referrals for white women and Black men because Black women were part of both of those groups. So this is kind of a cautionary tale in terms of very easy mistakes to make if you take a main effects analysis instead of an intersectional analysis. So in thinking through analysis, we can think about the same way we think in epidemiology, the distinction between descriptive and analytic studies. Descriptive being describing means, describing frequencies. We can think of it as an extension and equity stratifier methods. We're really quantifying inequalities across health and other outcomes with greater precision. And then we could think about taking an analytic approach to kind of causal questions and mediated pathways and intervention strategies and what it is that might in fact be driving any inequalities that we're seeing. And so I'm going to show you just a few things from an analysis that we're submitting shortly for a publication, and I'm happy to share with you if it's something that would aid you in your work. But we've been doing, Mary Mahendran's been leading a simulation study of a lot of different statistical approaches and how they would actually work for describing inequalities in populations across intersections of 5, 6 different social identities and position variables. So we can cross-classify, we can do regressions with interaction terms, we can do META, which is a multi-level analysis that it uses individual data, or there are a range of machine learning approaches, single tree approaches, and then random forest, which creates multiple trees. And they have different advantages and disadvantages in terms of what they offer. They all allow us to create intersection predictions. So how frequent is this outcome? What's the average outcome for people at all of these different intersections to be able to look for inequality? So if we're doing cross-classification, it could be as simple as just coding a few intersections, their ethno-racial background, bisexual, gender minority versus cisgender heterosexual people. This is psychological distress, but don't worry about that. I'm just kind of showing you a simple example of what this could look like. So cross-classification, we can just describe the distribution across different groups. We can do regression, linear or logistic or Poisson regression, and put in interaction terms as many people learn to do when they take statistics. From that, we can predict every single intersection, provided that we have data that's not case control data. Or we can do one of the regression tree type of methods where we start with a root node containing all of our participants, all of our data, and then we use branching, splitting algorithms to split that out to account for heterogeneity across different potential factors. So there's a range of ways we can do these. And what's important is that there's a whole body of literature that's developing in these areas now about statistical performance and also about how these methods map onto intersectional frameworks. So these are just a couple of examples of prediction of mean square error. So looking at our error in intersectional predictions across a range of data sizes. I know this looks like they're all large to some people because they start with 2,000, but with fewer intersections, the same things would apply at smaller data sizes. And we're using these methods and looking to see how they perform. There's some things you can probably see looking at this. Classification, regression trees part doesn't perform that well. But even the red, the fully specified regression model with all the interaction terms, doesn't work so well until you get to large sample sizes. And under some conditions, it doesn't work well. So again, I'm happy to share more details on this or to provide support to different groups as well and have a conversation if you think this would be helpful in your work in choosing methods that might work best to be able to explore intersectional heterogeneity within populations around COVID data. And so, we've just kind of started putting together these preliminary tables about, what we might actually recommend for smaller N data sets, larger N data sets, how's the validity of the estimates, if they provide different estimates, type 1 errors, people can prioritize what's important in choosing a method. And then if we move on to the analytic considerations, where we're looking at potential causes of different health outcomes, then we also need to think about how those social positions relate in an intersectional way. And so I should say that these methods will work just as well if you're considering one social identity or position, but we can code people into groups and we can say, we're interested in this factor and how it impacts this COVID-related outcome. We don't want to control for these social positions. We might produce results that are true for nobody. But we can look across pre-selected intersectional groups where we think that there might be important differences. And we can do an effect modification analysis and we can explore that. Do these causes, potential causes, do they impact health differently for people at different intersections? Where these causes might be occurring in a different historical, different social context, depending on people's intersectional positions. We can take the same kind of model here, and if we kind of turn it on its side, we can look at the same kind of questions, considering that cause is a mediator that might be the driver behind intersectional inequalities. And in this case, I think a lot of people are familiar with mediation analysis, but we can do analyses that combine mediation with interaction. And what that means is that we don't have to assume that the mediated effect is just due to different levels of, say, discrimination on an outcome. But it may also be due to discrimination or that mediator having a different impact on the outcome for people at different intersections. And there are some really cool mediation decomposition methods that we can use. I'm a fan of van der Waals causal mediation decomposition for this kind of thing, where we can say, if we do a theoretical change to that mediator, would there still be an effect on the outcome for people at different intersectional groups? Does that explain it? And it can also differentiate, how much of that effect is due to, say, an excess level of that mediator versus the interaction where the mediator has a different effect. So there's some ways we can structure these analyses in ways that allow, for my third point here, processes that generate outcomes are studied in a way that allows those processes to unfold differently for people at different intersections. So what does it take for a quantitative analysis to be intersectional? That, if we're doing analytic work, and if we go back to the first two, focus on categories that represent intersections of axes of social power. Though I will say it pairs well with, for example, some of the sex-related variables that might be more biological or might also be biological. And we also need statistical methods that allow for that heterogeneity of outcome at different intersections, and then that heterogeneity of processes at different intersections. So I just want to wrap up, just to leave a couple of things here. One is that I've just started a 4-year sex and gender science chair through CIHR. And as part of that, one of my goals is to do a lot of knowledge translation and methods development around SGBA+, around sex and gender, multidimensionality, and around the plus being intersectional applications. And so it's going to build on some of what I've been talking about. But what I want you to know importantly is that we're going to be producing an SGBA Plus methods toolkit. We're going to be doing workshops at conferences. The first one is going to be at World Congress of Public Health this fall, which unfortunately for me will not be in Rome, but fortunately for you, if you want to go, is now online. And then with my colleague, Dr. Lisa Boleg at the George Washington University, who chartered a new Intersectionality Training Institute, we were putting together a one-week intensive training on intersectionality methods and policy, qualitative methods as well as quantitative mixed methods and policy for an intensive week. That has now been postponed to 2021, but we're going to test run some of the content in online webinars in the fall. So that is something to look out for in terms of additional information that may build on some of the work, for example, that CIHR, Institute of Gender of Health, already has on SGBA+. And very lastly, I want to thank the brilliant people who contributed to a lot of the work that I've been showing you. They have light bulbs above their heads to indicate their brilliance. The people in my lab group who don't have light bulbs are also brilliant, by the way. They just weren't working on this project. And socially distancing over on the right are some of my colleagues who've also contributed to this work. Thanks.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. We've already had several requests for a link to the workshop that you just mentioned. So if you know the website off the top of your head, but otherwise I can.
For the World Congress of Public Health or for the Intersectionality Training Institute?
I think both.
Okay, so for the Intersectionality Training Institute, we're just in, as everybody is, I think, in salvage mode, that we were working toward a 1 day or a 1 week in-person intensive that we'd started planning the curriculum for back in August when we were more innocent. I traveled to Philadelphia. So now we haven't actually lined those up for the fall yet. So if you want to make a note to go to, I think the website is either just up or it's just going up, the Intersectionality Training Institute at the George Washington University in DC. And then World Congress of Public Health is the other one.
Fantastic. Given the theory that intersectionality is about how interlocking systems of power affect those who are most marginalized in society, quote, can you say more about how to incorporate themes of power and oppression when collecting and analyzing data using an intersectional approach?
Yeah, so I think that starts with the conceptualization. So even if you do a work that's basically descriptive and you're just presenting frequencies across different intersections, that can be work that, even with the same statistics, can be very different in terms of how it's presented from an intersectional approach, depending on how it's theorized and how the variables that are chosen, the way that it's done is rooted in social power, how the interpretation is done in that context of social power. So I talked a bit about the importance of context and about thinking through causes, explanations for things in advance, and kind of thinking through what the story is that might be responsible for something. So being rooted in systems of oppression can mean, I'm saying that's possible even if you're doing what seems like just a very simple descriptive analysis. Now you can build on that and do a much more complex analysis depending on how you theorize it, including bringing in multi-level considerations. There's a lot of discussion about how to measure structural discrimination, structural oppression, because there's some aspects that can't really be measured using individual self-report data, the kind of things we collect in surveys. But there are people who are working on that and trying to see if they can make that happen. But if we use multi-level data, if we look at neighborhood effects, if we start looking at kind of group level effects, then we have the potential to build in some structure in that way as well. So there's a lot of different ways. I made the point about descriptive analysis because even what seems like a very simple analysis can be done in a way that's deeply intersectional or in a way that's very superficial because of the scholarship and the interpretation that underlies it.
I think that ties right into the next question, which is in French, so please apologize for my accent. Comment intégrer ces variables à des études qualitative? How do these variables integrate into qualitative studies?
Right, so because I had a very limited time, I didn't talk about qualitative research, but intersectionality really made a much earlier entry into qualitative research. And then as a much later, it's just kind of really emerging in quantitative research just in the last decade or so, really. It wasn't really till about 15 years ago we started seeing quantitative analysis at all. So, in qualitative analysis, it's really different in terms of what you can do, because you can go much deeper within a particular intersection. You can do that kind of intracategorical exploration that really looks at what's happening with regard to lived experience at a particular intersection or comparing two intersections. With quantitative analysis, you can take massive data sets and you can basically screen for inequality across intersections that nobody's looking at. So I think the potential is very different. I think the potential for quantitative to generate new questions and generate new theory that then probably should be explored qualitatively in order to flesh that out is really important. So I see a big potential for mixed methods research. Now with qualitative research, you don't have quite the same issues with variables in the same way, because you're not forced to do the same kind of pragmatic categorization you often have to do with quantitative research. You can actually explore a bit more about how people identify, and talk about that in a bit of a richer way, because you're not forced to put them in a box in the same way. On the other hand, if you accept that pragmatic categorization, as I said, you can do a lot of things that get a very broad picture, or that look at broad trajectories of processes with quantitative research. So I see them as quite different, but also very powerful hand in hand, either explicitly in mixed methods research, or by quantitative researchers drawing on that qualitative research to build the theory that underlies their work, and vice versa, qualitative researchers looking at the quantitative findings to help kind of raise questions and inform what they're doing.
Fantastic. Tina Fahim says that they've been trying to recruit a diverse sample of participants to take part in qualitative interviews regarding their COVID experiences. And she's wondering if you have any guidance on how we should power a sample for qualitative data analyses using an intersectional approach, aiming to power for 3 primary intersecting domains.
Right, so power isn't power in a qualitative sense the way it is in a quantitative sense, because you don't have statistical power, right? What you're really looking for is enough people in different groups to be able to, reach saturation in the kind of experiences that you're hearing from people, to be able to really feel like you're describing those. So, I wouldn't talk about that as powering in the same way, but, often in the work that I've done that's been mixed methods, we'll use kind of a maximum diversity framework where we say we need at least X number of people in each of these groups. And many people will check multiple boxes, but we're just ensuring that we have enough kind of representation in different parts. And if you're exploring particular intersections, then you need to pay attention to that as well as just membership in individual groups. But if you pay attention to that, you'll often get, most of the intersections across those. So if you're aiming for a few specific ones, you're just going to have to set a number that you need, and then, perhaps be flexible to raise it if you're still getting a lot of new experiences from people. I think COVID research, well, obviously it's new to all of us. We're not really sure what we're going to be hearing, how broad the ranges of experience we're going to be hearing from people, and what that's going to look like.
So there's a lot of thanks and appreciation for your great presentation. Another question, could you provide some insight on how to measure age critically to allow for identity intersectionality factors across the lifespan life course to be considered as well?
To measure age critically. So I actually am really more interested in age than you might have gotten from this presentation, because I think people tend to use age in a very knee-jerk way. And then they tend to think age causes a lot of things, when age is just a numeric progression through time. So when I think of using age in a critical way, I think of asking myself, if I found an age-related effect, what would my questions be? What would my potential explanations be? Where would my brain go? How would I want to explain that? And then always the next question is, can I measure that, right? So I feel like for people who saw Portlandia, the episode where they're like, you can pickle that? So my today, I'm just like, you can measure that. You can measure that. And so, with age, so if you found an age-related effect, you've seen it in papers. You've all seen it in papers. We found this. This could be due to this. This could be due to this. This could be due to this. And there's all the speculation in the interpretation section. You could have measured that. So do your speculation in advance and say, what would I want to know if I found something? And that's going to guide your thinking, on what you need to be thinking about in your theorization of it as well.
Well, we are well over our time and we're already starting to drop off. So I will just do the one last question, which was the next one down the list. With the current limited data collection about race and socioeconomic status in Canada, what options exist to use existing data to demonstrate inequalities between different populations?
Ooh, that's something I'm thinking about right now. I don't have a clear answer for. So we do have data, like the Statistics Canada data sets that they're collecting the impacts of COVID-19 on Canadians and the Perspective series. Those do have some data on that. You know, I'm looking to try to see what I think is the better data. I know that I and other CanCOVID people gave feedback to the Immunity Task Force for the seroprevalence surveys when those happened, with regard to the importance of collecting race data on that, socioeconomic data. So I'm hoping that they'll do a good job with that. I really want to see that attached to the seroprevalence data. So our options right now are to try to impact the data collection going forward, to use the data available through StatsCan or other places as it is. And I think there's been a lot of push, but we need to keep pushing for collection of those data to the extent possible as attached to the test data for positive cases, but also as attached to death data, because we don't have a lot of information attached to COVID-related deaths. And so it's a change in the whole process. Like, we're changing how data are collected. There aren't, ways, there's not a COVID form that goes with a death reporting. Maybe there needs to be,
Maybe there needs to be. Thank you so much for your time. I apologize that we didn't get to all of the questions, but feel free to continue the conversation on the CanCOVID Slack. If you've got a question that you think Greta would like to weigh in on, just type at Greta Bauer and,
Yep.
and then she'll answer. She's actually quite responsive on the Slack, which is great.
Oh, am I? I feel like I'm not, because I'm not on there all the time, but I do check in regularly. So.
You answer every time I tag you, so I'm offering that other people can do the same. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon and a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everyone.